Welcome back. We're moving into our second painting focused on reflections, but before doing so, I have a few other examples that we've done to help illustrate the great possibilities in reflections. Both of these these little sketches in front of me, share a common trait. They're a combination of warm and cool. On this, my left hand, is a warm stream and sky, and cool snow and trees surrounding. On the right, we have a cool sky, cool land, and even cool water with a warm background and a little bit of warmth in the stream. So it's a combination and proportion. The other issue is that these are really different. On the left, the darker values are in the cools, and so that the water is lighter, moving from a darker to almost a pure white. And on this example, the water is dark and the surroundings are light. Again, both strong contrast, so you can distinguish where the water really is. But it begins to show some of the opportunities that exist for painting reflections. Paintings can be moderate as a part of the scene or very small as part of the scene. And as we'll see in these next two examples, can differ again. This scene is largely a wetland meadow scene, and some reflections and the very small part of the open water on the left corner. So there's a dynamic, the color jumps between the two parts, and it becomes a playful event. But essentially we have distinct zones, a embankment and water zone, a central zone of light value and horizontal and level, and a background zone that has both trees, warmth, etc. in it. Note that the warmth of the painting dances through the painting in part all the way to the front. And we have a direction of light, dark to light. But reflections can be a smaller part of a painting in a dynamic location, in this case the lower left, or they can be larger, as in this scene, where they're more central, and where the painting is largely a reflection, lots of warmth, and an accent of cool that includes both the land and the trees, the evergreen trees. And then lots of light and warmth in the remainder, and the reflection, trees being slightly smaller than land around them somehow, and foggy distance looking off. So lots of possibilities for the realm of painting. We're going back then, having seen these, to this example where we are losing the source of the reflections but can see it only in the water. So there's a puddle in a grassy field and the puddle is lighter. So this is an example reversing our earlier sketch where the water was darker. In this case, it's the lightest and the surrounding is darker. But we're going to make one exception in the coming piece. We're going to try to show the source, at least a little bit of the trunks of the trees on land that are causing the reflection. So there's a stronger correlation for those who might be bothered by not knowing where those trees are. So that's the game plan. We're going to produce a version of this with some changes. Starting again, we'll divide using the kneaded eraser to lift up any pencil marks that remain. We're going to divide it in approximate thirds. Note that this is not exact measurements, so we have a sense and purposely avoid putting or placing our scene in the center. Also, we want to make sure that the pond, the subject with the reflections, are a worthy part of the scene, but maybe somewhat reduced in size from here. So that's what we'll be thinking about. And let's not make the upper and lower even, so we're going to reduce the bottom part of the pond. And because it was a dynamic edge, at a 1/3 position we'll create something interesting, move down, and then maybe back up. So we have a smaller bottom piece that will be land. We have a larger centerpiece that will be land. And moving about at the other 1/3 position. And then within that we can have some divisions as well, where there's pieces of land, not unlike the scene that we've had earlier. And that's ending up right in the middle. So what we're going to do is divide this piece of open water into thirds and move it up just a bit so it's not the same. And then this one slides by lower on the bottom piece. Okay, good enough for division. And we won't worry about trees for now. We're going to create and color the scene. As we did earlier today, we're going to take the kneaded eraser, make it cleaner and lighter by kneading it so that the graphite already on the eraser is embedded and lost in the eraser itself. And we're doing a kind of light pressure lift for all the loose graphite on the surface. We're going to start with most watercolors with a light center. And so, moving water within reach, we have yellows and other lighter paint, pinkish paint. And so we're creating a kind of whole milk, mid-level to lighter scene. And we're going to end up painting the center part, at least, of this painting. Going to actually do one more line and show a little bit of sky. So we're adding some dynamics to this scene. We're going to divide that into thirds. We're going to divide that into thirds. So we're going to show that much sky. This will be sky. And then this will be land again upon which trees will sit. So we need to know that for a couple of reasons. We're about to paint with as pure a paint as we can make. This is actually called June Brilliant. So we're mixing some paints. I'm going to then place water across the whole scene. The graphite's gone away. We don't mind if we go into the darker paint because that'll be covered later. So we're essentially covering the whole painting with pure water in this case. We're going to erase the edges so that puddles of water on the tape are disappearing. Having done that and have already mixed some of the June Brilliant paint and some of the yellow, light bumblebee yellow, we're going to end up putting some paint down on the pond where it most is effective, but we're moving more into June Brilliant, so there's a combination of yellow to the June Brilliant on the scene. And we're going to make sure that happens for the sky as well. And the remainder is not so important. So that's the first part of the painting, claiming it, but essential that it be thin paint on the 1% to 2% milk scale, and critical that it also be more than one color. So I've just added a little bit of charging of additional June Brilliant into the painting in a couple of places for interest. That'll come up and show beautifully in a short while. Moving from there to drying. Our next step is to color each of the zones that surround the pond and make it lift. So we'll start with the upper and the lower piece and then the islands that are resting in the pond and leaving, of course, the sky out. So I'll start with the larger sky piece, but the first thing we need to do is to take the mid-sized brush and make sure that we have pools of paint sufficient. I'm looking at maybe burnt umber, not sure exactly anymore. Maybe this is burnt umber and that's sepia. So we're making puddles of different paint. We've got 2 or 3 in a row here, each of them slightly different than the next. And we can even mix up some greens to drop in there so we have some variation, and if needed, so they're puddles. And if we do the test strips, they'll be in the realm of mid-range whole milk. Next step then is to wet, again, the water piece. Leaving a little color in is no problem because they'll come later. But imagine this is being put down as something closer to pure water. Not going into the pond in this case. And I'm pointing at it with a brush, and my hand at this moment is on the table. Then I'm going to add a little paint and more water just to begin to color this scene. Now, without moving up with the brush, I'm going to turn it so that I have the same luxury of control and pointing at the line accurately from this side. And we're going to fill up the remainder of the piece. Now we have a wet background piece surrounding the pond, and it's the opportunity to begin painting. But before we do, we're going to make a decision. Since everything wants to move from darker to lighter, we're going to start with darker near the pond edge and lighter as we go up towards the sky. So that being the case, we'll start with our darkest paints with the indigo yet to come in that area. I'm not going back to the same puddle of paint having put that much down. Going to another location, going in this paint and moving it out. Going in that paint and moving it out. So we are having, along the edge, variation in value. I'm actually going to the green now, going into here and pulling out the green. And I might go to another form of brown or yellow as well, or to the quinacridone gold and put it in and pull it out. So we're having lots of color in this zone. Purposely pulling that out, making a little leg, and we are again doing dark on the bottom side. And if we start doing crazy and wild strokes without being continuous, there will be some relief in the color as we move up. And if we take some of the paint off, rinse the brush and make it slightly thirstier, we can still put a little of the brown color down, maybe some of the warmer color, and have it move in its value from the darker bottom near the pond. So that didn't happen unless we told ourselves that's what we were doing. We need a strategy. Darker to lighter, mixing the colors. Then we're going to take wherever it's dark and add additional darkness near it, tease it out. Wherever it's dark, different strokes each time, teasing out slightly darker, more. So we're having changes happen. Slightly darker, maybe with the green, pull it out just a bit more, and just a bit more. So we end up with quite a range. We're essentially going to do this a second time and leave that dry for a bit. And we're going to do the bottom edge. Again, clean the brush mostly. Water on the bottom edge. And that's drying nicely for us. Putting the hairdryer on that at this point would blow it around and reduce some of the intricacies of the color that are really, in lots of ways, delightful. I'm putting medium pressure on the brush and watching the tip, and then I'm being wild and crazy after that. So in a similar way, we're going to start, but reversing the order. The darkest will be near the pond. And I'm going purposely for a second stroke in a different color, pulling it out, and a different place, and pulling it out. So we're mixing the colors, and darker we go, back to the edge, and looking for even darker paint. along the edge. So we're beginning to surround our pond. I think you're beginning to see that happen. And dropping in, this is called charging, adding additional darker color into the zone that's already been wet and painted. So we're having quite a delightful little piece. And back at the back edge, we're going to lighter colors. And sometimes they're surprising lighter colors. We're going to continue that for the two islands. This is still drawing. We had it pretty wet, so it's working beautifully. We're going to wet the islands and do the same thing with them, because they're part of the family of container, but they happen to be floating in the pond. One, this is pure water again. Dry pond around us. Dry, dry. Wet land. Carefully done. Follow the edges. Don't go over. And charge. This can be done shorter strokes and not big long strokes helpful. As we go, filling up that space with multiple colors, different strokes almost each time, short distances, not big long strokes, and being careful with the edges. And going lighter as we go to the periphery. If it gets too dark again, convert this to a mop and lift up some of that paint. And so we have the dark to light variation. We'll be doing the same thing on this island. Really dark in here, really dark in here, and maybe along the bottom edge, in this case, like that edge and this edge. Now I'm going to do some crazier strokes just for some additional darkness in the scene. And now we're finishing this guy, moving around. If it isn't quite dark enough, back to some Quin Gold. A little bit of variation on the bottom edge is a good thing. So we'll leave the serendipity and exaggerate it. And we might even add some serendipity at that edge. Tease. So this is the opportunity to come in with slightly darker paint. And it can be almost any color. It can be green or darker in the browns. But we're going to do modest strokes. So let's go back to the original section. This is still wet. We can see that the water is there. But we can do some additional strokes in this zone that are short, repeated, and maybe grass-like. And we'll move to a slightly smaller brush so for finer strokes. And I'm purposely going in multiple directions and letting it kind of blend itself in, knit itself together. Bottom edge a little bit darker, not all the way to the edge of the paper, so we get that dark to light business happening. Because this is the center of the paper, we're going to be doing some extra dark in that location and in this location. Okay. So now we have the surroundings of the pond done. Actually, what we'll do with the upper edge is smooth it out just a bit because it wants to be the top of a slope. Paint's a little dark. That's correctable totally. There we go. And move ourselves back in so the darkness again blends all the way up to this zone. And that's smoother land up there. Wherever your eye goes, that means it's probably not quite resolved or finished. And when it's finished, your eye won't go there. It goes on to the place that isn't finished. Okay. I would like to get the water reasonably close while still allowing myself enough room to work. And I'm going to go for some really deeper zone right there. Okay. So there's plenty of change of color and so on. Just in and of itself, that mass of foliage and leaves is pretty interesting. We have one more step to go with that, but it's only after we dry it. So now we're going to add trees, and previously we had like 3 sizable trees. So in this case, I'm going to have a tree near the 1/3 position and sizable, and have it move into the land just a little. So it's going to come down and in 1/3 the way across this guy. So we're just beginning to see the roots of that tree. And if we did this right, it'll point towards the center and have less point going that direction. So that's a tree, and we can go back to having our trunk moving down and tapering just a bit. But we can also end up having some branches move off of it. We'll redo more of that later. Going for a second tree. Okay. So there's 2 of the 3 trees. Then we're going to create quite a sizable space and go back to the other 1/3 position, make the center space bigger so it moves over from the 1/3 position. Again, this tree might be leaning into the scene, and we can add other branches and texture as we go. Now we move back to our mid-sized brush. Let's paint the existing trees on the land first, and we have to think about a direction of sunlight. Let's make the darker side on the left side and lighter as we move to the right. And that's going to happen for the shadow as well, and all the way across. It might get lighter. I want to make sure it goes right to the end of the ledge, the land. And back we go to lighter brown and other color. And clean the brush, make it a mop, thirsty, lift some of the paint on that edge so it's lighter. And make sure you go after it, and make sure there's plenty of brown and other warm colors in the trunk, not only the dark. All the way go to the corner. Gets a little bit lighter as we go up. We're again, just like the land, adding lots of interesting color to this scene. This is happening with this guy, and we're going to solve the rest of that by making it lighter and having it point into the scene and point into the scene, and taking paint off, making it lighter, changing the color, making it browner and warmer. And on we go with painting the reflection. Not always advisable, but doing it with the same color on the brush brings a correlation. Sometimes, as we've seen in an earlier painting, the reflections are a different color on the water because of the light conditions, sun, or the color of the water, apparent color of the water itself. There we go. Around we are. And darker left side. And those sections. We're going to move to a mid-size rigger brush, which looks like this, I guess, and begin to do the smaller branches with the rigger brush, and if possible adding to our indigo some other colors. We still want to make that darker. We still want it to be indigo. But when we move off, I'm bracing my hand, keeping the same angle, and changing the colors of the branching. We're going to have a branch ultimately come across, goes into that part of the scene, and another. So the angle of the rigger brush is a little unforgiving, and you need to keep it the same rather than pushing it or doing other things with the brush. So we're ending up with some texture on the edge. We need to turn the paper against to our own good advantage. Hopefully you can see it. And any lines that we choose not to use can be erased after we're done. So we're holding them as a target zone, but we're making it look even better once we have the paint in our brush and are actually making those branches. We're going to wait till that dries and take some darker branches across the entire trunk of the tree. And even though I'm doing it quickly, I'm attempting to be accurate in having them connect and getting those smaller ones which make this believable as a real tree. And of course we know it's not, so it's a trick. Okay. One to go. Going into dark paint, we have it on the left-hand side again. Again, it doesn't go all the way in or across. I'm doing it with the rigger. You can do it both ways. Or with a medium or smaller brush. Changing. I have a nice purplish color here as well. Remove some of that in, but I'm leaving and reserving some space at the edge for the mopping action, so we end up with lighter paint there. And then we can move on. My hand movement over that trunk made some really interesting things happen. This will now be only the parts that are on the water. And we're going to come back in with heavy-duty dark at that edge. We're going to lift some of the paint at that edge. So we end up with the roundness. Darken that edge. And one big section to go. Make sure it's dark enough. And I'm painting purposely no more than about a third. Moving it to another color into the brown world or the green world. Adding not the full width, but some dimension. Change it. Adding something that's even lighter at the edge. So that in this big, broad tree reflecting on the ground, there's even more variation than might even be above. We're not seeing that, of course, because it's above the line. We're doing that with the mid-sized brush. Our rigger is in our hand. We can add strokes and create interest in texture. A little bit of dark underneath that guy. So more texture there, and we're going to need, of course, a bit of texture in this zone as well. So I'm trying to keep most of it cool and calm without texture. Go right to the edge and add to it and build on it. If and as needed. The bottom of that edge will be darker. The bottom of this guy will be darker. So there's some rules that if we follow them, help us make decisions as we go along. Paint off, thin lines, pull the brush You can get very thin lines doing this, and they become believable. Okay. So we have one last thing to do. That is to add additional texture. We're going to dry the branches. We'll do a couple of things before moving on. One would be to change the value of the background color. Remember, it needs to be pretty pure, but as will often happen, it ended up being essentially a single value. So making the corner darker without adding essentially any paint there, very little anyway, we create a variation. And we'll do the same thing down below, just changing that slightly. So we have more variation in the sky. Dry it. At the ridge of this little hillside where the trees are standing, we can easily add in some grasses. And we're doing these tufts and the melding out. And we're going to do it again. And so we're adding some texture and some visual interest in that zone of the painting. We're going to do it on the land, but make sure one does it in the full-blown darkness of the indigo. And also on the land, in indigo, moving down into the painting. That line is pretty smooth for a long distance. I'm going to divide it into thirds, and at one position, interrupt it with some browner grasses that are a little lighter at one place. Then, when we have grasses, back to our indigo, at the edge of the scene, we can end up having some additional texture surrounding our centerpiece. We want to make sure there's not a lot. Grasses at the edge that will add up to some texture on the water. That can happen in a couple of places. Next step, fairly dark paint to create some interest in this zone. Where it's already dark, dragging this with amoeba-like surfaces. So we're adding yet one more layer of dark zone that isn't like brushing. It isn't any stroke that we're making up. I see we lost a little bit with my hand. This has to be darker. We can add texture at this point with the dark paints by just crazy strokes on the surface. The amoeba that we talked about in one of the latter sessions. Doing that on the surface. Note, watch my hand, I'm going in different directions. So it's not a repetition as we've been to this point. So we're adding craziness and essentially surface texture. And we're doing it at the edges of the dark places. There's a dark place, we're going to add to that edge. There's a dark place, we'll add to that edge. There's a place that needs a little texture, we'll rub some dry brush on it for texture. We're getting the texture that makes it look more like leaves and grass that we wish it to be. A little bit of interest needed there, just a bit. Add on to what's already there rather than going to a new place. Build from what's there. Looking pretty good. Need some below and some here and here. Shouldn't take long. We'll be with it. And in the zone of the trees, we're going to add just a bit here. So the light sneaks through. And we're going to do it down here as well. and adding texture here, but again, has to be darker than what's there. What's already dark, expand it. What's already dark, expand it. All of a sudden, just like that, it comes alive. That we have in a small zone, what you're beginning to see is medium, light, darker and darker, 4 or 5 values, close together. That's producing the richness that allows us to make it believable and to make it look real. They might be the same thing, believable and real. Simulation, texture on the surface. One last thing, and that is to think about it with a toothbrush. And that taking some dark paint, doing a test strip, and adding some additional texture, especially one has to test each time because loading the brush is such a difficult thing to control. And then we're putting texture with the toothbrush near the center, not over here at the edge, but around this focus point of the painting. And then maybe a little bit those other places. And if we were to get a mat to look at this with reflections. But in this case, we have a dark surround, lighter water, and we have a source of the reflections in the scene. So we started here. We could add more texture if we needed, but that's the way one goes. So, reflections. They're ephemeral, they catch our attention, they're fleeting, they're endlessly interesting, and they are often in areas of high contrast. And so all of those things add up to supreme interest, and they're worthy subjects for paintings. See you next time for the next session.